Hello, and welcome to ICA in Conversation, that broadcasts twice a month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider how effective compliance can help business to achieve its goals. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Gaon Hart, Managing Director of Legal Advisory Worldwide and Interim Chair of the NHS Counter Fraud Authority here in the United Kingdom. Gaon is a former government advisor and senior lawyer in the context of policy and advocacy. Gaon, welcome, and thank you for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we're going to, over the next 30 minutes, address some key, simple examples of how effective compliance can support business in achieving their commercial goals. Now, rather than the usual format of speaking in a conversation for 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes responding to questions, Gaon has suggested that we respond to any questions that you might have as we go along. So please use the comments section of the event on LinkedIn to raise questions that you might have. And we will attempt to pick them up at an appropriate time, and where we can, we'll respond to them. But we have got a lot that we want to talk about and not too much time to do that. So we'll try and stay fairly focused nonetheless. But let me set the scene by briefly recognizing that, of course, compliance has evolved. It's evolved significantly over the last decades. There was perhaps a time when we saw compliance as focusing mainly, well, on legal regulatory requirements, external requirements imposed on business. But now we can see that as well as this, as well as ensuring compliance with those external factors, compliance has a vital role in defining and driving internal requirements. Requirements such as good governance, effective risk management, good communication, efficiency, and corporate resilience. And it's with this in mind that we are going to consider those examples of really good compliance work involving yourself, Gaon. So thank you again for joining me in this conversation. I think we're going to focus on three. And here, the issues aren't so much to unpack the theory, the practices, it's just simply to see the impact that good compliance can have. So drawing on your experience in this area, I think the first one we're going to consider is around how you, leading a compliance capability, enabled a large organization to achieve a contract that would have otherwise been outside of their reach. Is that a fair description? And can you talk us through that, Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, we've all had, I think what's happened in compliance over the last few years is any compliance officer has heard the phrases, compliance doesn't understand my business requirements, or, other companies ignore their compliance requirements. Why are our compliance teams such pedants or petty pedants? I've heard various versions of that. Or, they're just a drain on resources. And I think the challenges for compliance officers is to find a place for them to sit in the business. So one of the concepts is contractual bids. There's a lot of work going on within organizations where they're bidding for different contracts. And part of the bid will obviously be financial, it will be capability, it will be resource led, it will be people, etc. All the elements that would attract someone to your business. But compliance now has to play and does play a significant part in that. No one wants to be, even if we take the American few challenges and changes that are occurring, no one wants to be associated with an organization or a bid and contractual relationship where there's likely to be challenges, bribery, corruption, money laundering, etc. So one of the things that with one organization that I worked with was they were bidding for a major £400 million or so infrastructure financing in a country where dam and energy production was desperately needed and required, but a country that had a large, challenging reputation, shall we say, for corrupt activities, with a construction group of companies that all had had previous for, you know, types of bribery and corruption elements. So it was about putting together with them. The team spent over a year putting together with the bid team demonstrable capabilities for how you could make it clean, how you could ring fence your finances, how you could ensure that all invoices were reviewed and checked, how you could make sure that there wasn't bribery in built, that it was benchmarked across industry standards, ensuring that the clients who really wanted this, and this, my company that I was working for at the time, wanted that intermediary process. And so we put together a compliant element. Now, I'm not saying that the bid was won entirely because of the work that the compliance team did, but I don't think it hurt. And in fact, what better, the work we did with that business team, who were a high functioning, very well regarded team within the organization, they became our biggest proponents and they helped us train others. They helped us present to other divisions and teams. So you get that reputational benefit internally, but also that business benefit if the contractual bids. And there must be places that you can sit at the table. I don't know if anyone is a Hamilton fan, but it's be in the room when it happens. That's the key. You always want to be in the room because actually you can support it.
Okay, I feel there's a lot we could unpack there, but the risks associated with that contract were, well, they sound like they were off the scale in terms of the jurisdictions involved, in terms of the products, infrastructure, construction, and the like, and in terms of the customers and the various third parties that you were working with. And I know when we talked about this before, you shared that one of the challenges was actually navigating to a point that those risks were brought within appetite. There was a danger that simply ruled it out. That it became too much, too risky, and what you were able to do was facilitate access to something that would otherwise have been beyond it. Again, is that a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always advise the teams in various locations where I worked, which was, your role is to say yes, but demonstrate how they can get to yes. Everyone thinks, oh, you're the no team. Or if you're in bribery and corruption, you're the fun police or other phraseology. But it's how you can get to yes. It's showing the capability. And in that particular bid, at least two organizations, major institutions, had pulled out because they couldn't find a way to manage the risks. So the fact that this organization was even willing and capable of offering it, and it was straight. I mean, it's not easy. As I said, it took a year or so to construct various protections, to be transparent, etc., to decide where the money went, to focus on invoices, to ensure that government capabilities were limited in the impact, to benchmark the pricing. All of those structures that you can put in place should be where compliance really adds value. It's not the policy or the process or the simple system. It is that using your intellectual capability, which takes you beyond the AI.
So again, I mean, this is really helpful. I think if we can go a little bit further with this, what you've described is that compliance partnered with the decision makers, partnered with the rest of the business in order to share their goals, share their energy, excitement about realizing their ambition and enabling that to take place. So it is a different way of considering compliance, certainly to the way in which some have described it. And you've talked about the fun, the fun police. I'm not sure what to make of that. I think something else that we have seen, though, is this mantra, which is often played out. If you think compliance is expensive, you should try the cost of non-compliance, which is true, and there's value to that. But I think it paints a picture of compliance as being reactive, as being somehow holding the keys, as being distant, remote, as being the permission providers, rather than partners who are enabling and sharing the experience. So thank you. That's really, really helpful. Should we move on to the second of the cases? And we touched on this before, and I think it was about the for a large, for PLC, for a large company managing investor relations at a particular time where you were able to provide reassurance and assert the culture and the positive way in which the company you served was meeting compliance requirements and wider requirements. Again, I'm not sure if I've paraphrased that phrase that fairly.
No, I think you have. I mean, if you just going back to what you said before, global compliance cost is about $206 billion a year. That is how much companies across the globe spend on compliance. But it doesn't stop the fact that last year, 2024, there was 14 billion around about, depending on which figures you take, of regulatory and legislative fines against companies. So yeah, we're always termed as oh, you're protecting, your rule is going to stop my business, but it will make it safe and sustainable. And some people get that and some don't. But it's also, we know that it's anywhere between what, 500 billion and $2 trillion worth of ethical investment and integrity investments. We're looking at companies like Energy One a few years ago that actually advised and required a major company to change the board constitution because they weren't happy, and they were ethical investors and they encouraged it. And in one organization that I was advising, they were facing investors pulling out. About $2 billion worth of investment was being withdrawn by the pension funds because they'd had a hit in relation to integrity, and the investor funds didn't feel comfortable investing and continuing investment. So you brought on the usual investor relations teams. They were there as part of it, but because it was specifically around compliance, they actually asked us and my team to get involved and to advise and to assist and to sit in the room. And we explained what we were doing. We were very transparent about the ambitions. We were transparent about, and this is where the policies, the processes, the systems, we explained our thresholds, our appetites. We explained due diligence. We explained third-party coordination. We explained internal systems. And again, it wasn't entirely due to us. The organization was a very good bet, etc. Return on investment, as we were talking about earlier, was key. But the reality is, once again, we were there, we were helping.
Yeah.
They did protect the investment, didn't necessarily because of us, but again, we were there, we were in the room, and again, we got the gratitude internally and the greater realization that, compliance is more than a bunch of rule makers and rule coordinators, that we were actually there helping to drive positive attitudes. And whatever you think about Trump, or whatever you think about America and the way it's going, and the European recent ESG downgrading, etc., the reality is compliance is still going to be an important element for investors. And that's another place you can get involved.
So, I mean, this is really interesting because we are seeing, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, that there is a greater investor awareness and concern about, as you say, ethical investments. That can go in a number of different directions, of course, and that can present some particular difficulties. We've seen, for instance, in the context of the armaments industry, which is an important part of our infrastructure. We need armaments. You might disagree on some level around that, but in order to defend our shores, we need armaments. But some investors have looked to move away from the armaments industry because of their perceived concerns on an ethical level, which we can understand. But I think this illustrates the wider point that companies need to not only be profitable, but also demonstrate to investors, key stakeholders, and so on, that they're meeting certain challenges, certain ethical standards. And this is, of course, where you've had an important role to play. And I think, once again, what we see is that that's a sort of partnership approach. There's a story there that you, within compliance, have been able to develop a narrative that explains how you support the business, how you serve the business, and how that has transformed the way in which the business takes place to meet a series of requirements. And you can articulate that.
And I think, I mean, the challenge is compliance officers aren't sitting there with their feet up on the table doing nothing. they're busy enough as it is, and there's a lot on their plate. And I speak to compliance officers globally, and particularly at the moment, there's a huge amount of changes, regulatory updates, important, developments, and you've got to keep up to date with that. Your teams are being shrunk because we know national insurance, all the other problems around the world are restricting. So it is not, but actually, long-term sustainability, almost for the compliance team, requires an element of that business partnership, of getting involved in the conversations around how you drive growth and profit. As I say, I'm chair of the NHS Counter Fraud Authority, as you said, and the reality is the government's growth agenda is hitting us. We're in Protect, Prevent, and Investigate, an amazing organisation that's trying to prevent the 1.3 billion pounds worth of fraud at risk in the NHS and the health sector, which is a huge amount. But we've still got an element there, and the government have still said we also want you to help drive growth and protect growth. And the National Hospitals Building Programme, how can we protect it from, the procurement from fraud? So you've got to allocate a small amount of your intellectual resources
Yeah.
in order to be able to do that. So you get that relationship building, and it's hard. It is tough. I've been there. I've seen the pressures, but you can do it if you isolate certain parts and you really focus on that element, and that makes the rest of your job easier eventually. And then you get sort of economies of scale.
So the danger from what you say, the danger is that as we quite rightly respond to legal and regulatory change, and it's diverse, it's challenging, we're increasingly seeing across the world a multipolar approach to this. There isn't necessarily a consistent narrative around how we should do this. That generates still more work. As we are responding to that, I think the danger is that we become quite reactive, that we're constantly having to look at our policies, our processes, evaluate and audit our systems against these and so on. And that somehow in doing that, we lose sight of the bigger picture in terms of what we offer. And in particular, on that, the story, the narrative around, and that, of course, is what you were able to provide in providing assurance to investors. There is a story. And I think it would be an interesting exercise to ask colleagues around the world, if you were challenged, could you set out in 2 or 3 minutes what you are as a compliance function, what your role is, what your ambition is, how you work with the businesses that you serve, and placing the emphasis on that service rather than somehow seeing yourselves as being above the business in some way. And that's an important mindset. But let's
Yeah, I
move
mean, I
on
think
to
I think I
sorry,
think if you spend all your time in fire prevention, in firefighting, you end up not being able to do any fire prevention. And that's part of the key. And we do that a lot in the NHS Counter Fraud Authority, where we really focus equally on the investigation and the prosecution, but also on the prevention, because we know that saves us on the other side and makes us more sustainable.
yeah. So on that note, actually, we have a question that's come from Raj Priyanka, who's asking about his role within an organization that's looking to expand in Europe and America. And he's interested in, well, what are the practical issues that he needs to consider, licensing, processing, and so on. Now, that's challenging because, of course, they're going in different directions at the moment. Arguably, EU is doubling down on quite a wide range of regulatory developments. America, a little bit compromised in its approach and its thinking, hasn't quite figured out what it's going to look like. But the mood music is stepping away from legal and regulatory requirements. But any thoughts on that, Gaon?
Well, I mean, if you look at the statistics, United States and Canada last year, I think their compliance costs were about 61 billion, but the EMEA costs were around 85 billion. So it shows that the regulatory burden in Europe is expanding, although actually we've seen some recent commentary about reductions, particularly in the ESG field, reporting requirements, and removing a lot of organizations from that. It's the plans anyway. I think the challenge is to dissect each part. So I worked for a specific in the oil and gas sector for an organization who wanted to move into the American market. And then it was a question of saying, okay, these are the regulatory requirements for the American market. And we created a sort of list, and we created a tick box, and then compared and contrasted with the European and what they already had. So I think it's a large part. I think the key is focus on mapping the differentials. If you get your mapping the different, what is there, what isn't, the rest of it, you will then find that a lot of your compliance is effective across all. It's not, there's no one way to skin a cat. And I think you'll find that actually, although actually the rules are different, the compliance capabilities require tweaking. So you and I are doing a masterclass in failure to prevent fraud and the new offence coming in. That doesn't require a revolution in your policies and processes. It requires an evolution, small changes, adaptations in different policies and processes. And we sort of guide them through that. And I think that's always my advice. Don't reinvent the wheel, just look to see how you can use it in a slightly different way. A lot of your compliance will already be there, your functions. You'll have risk mapping, you'll have EWRAs, you'll have thresholds, you'll have policies that cover it, you'll have some systems and processes, you'll have your due diligence. Just look to see, once you get your mapping perfected, the rest flows, and then you'll be able to save yourself times in the long run. It's preparation, preparation, preparation.
So, I mean, you touched along the way on the failure to prevent fraud masterclass that you and I have, well, mainly yourself, Gaon, that you've led, and I think very successfully. It's worth just mentioning that we're looking to potentially host another. So, if you are interested, then let us know through the ICA website. But can I pick up on one of the things that you talked about there, and that was mapping requirements. So, I guess my perspective on that is slightly different because if you can do that, if you're able to map the requirements and it can give you confidence, then that's the key. If you've got confidence around, well, if we move into this particular market, these are the particular requirements and you understand them, if you can speak with confidence, then you can have a partnership with the business. You can actually talk about how you can enable the business to be successful in those markets, to manage the particular risks that it gives rise to. That is a far better position than constantly reactively having to listen to what the business wants and then maybe spend a week or two going away, trying to understand what the requirements are, interpreting that locally and coming back to give the answer to the business. Yes, you can do this or you can't. Far better is to map it in the way that you describe, have a handle on it so that you're then partnering the business in that conversation synchronous to say, yeah, that I need to do maybe some more work, but that looks like that's going to work. And how about this? Because you could even go into that market and you can grow into this area and so on. Thoughts on that? Is that a fair description?
I think it is. I mean, I think one of the other areas we were going to talk about was mergers and acquisitions. And I think that's a very good example of one of the changes that I made or with my team,
Mm, mm.
where we were finding that the problem was we were being approached about targets and mergers. So particularly in financial institutions, every time you do a debt for equity swap with the organization, it's effectively a merger. So they are essentially doing multiple mergers across a full range. And what would happen is the business would always sit there and go, is it financially viable? Is it a product that matches our other products? Is it capability that we want? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd come, what's the return on investment? What's the capability, et cetera. So they would come out and they would say, fine, we love. And they'd spend hundreds and if not thousands of man hours, and it should say person hours, working on that basis and arranging it. And then they'd start negotiating cost, price, how much is the acquisition going to be worth, etc. And then finally, they'd come to us at the last minute and go, okay, so what's the compliance risks here? And we'd sit there and go, well, hold it a second. You've arranged the price, you've arranged everything. If we say no, and they would be furious, or they would say, well, we can't do that now. It's too late. We've already agreed that. So we decided that we worked really hard. One of the things I did was I went fairly senior to persuade the organization to bring compliance in at the first part. And that would enable also us to get involved in the costs. So that instead of reactive on an individual basis at a last minute notice, we actually were there at the beginning and we could map risks across a range of investments and targets early. And that enabled us actually to get involved in the pricing. So in one example, we highlighted specific fraud risks, which they hadn't thought of in the business. And the business turned around and went, well, what do you think? And I said, well, fine, we can accept and we can manage those fraud risks, but it's going to cost us. So before you negotiate the price, add that into the price. And actually, the negotiated price was significantly lower. Again, not entirely due to us. I never think that compliance is totally responsible. No one turns around and goes, "Oh, you're a rubbish organization, but you're very compliant, so I'll give you my business." But what they do is, again, it helped to negotiate and it was part. So the price reflected the genuine cost. And so again, we were at the table and we became quite a respected partner because we were involved in the negotiations in a subtle way at an early stage. And that's what I think you were talking about, which is a really good example of it.
So, as well as the requirement to understand the particular markets, the regulatory context, and so on, sufficiently to have a real-time synchronous conversation and add value to it, there's also something about understanding the business, understanding the operating model of the business, the supply chains, understanding sufficiently well to be able to add value to conversations. And again, that's not a reactive, you tell me and I'll give you a decision in 2 weeks' time and I want you to answer all these questions. No, it's having those questions already answered in your mind. You're partnering, you're part of the conversation early on rather than towards the end of the day. And because you've got that knowledge and understanding, you've got the confidence to make contribution to the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 2 days with the trade finance team because we were worried about how they book trades and the influence that it could have. If you book a trade early for a big client, it would change the market value potentially if it was big enough. And that might therefore impact other clients. And there were lots of regulatory rules, and the regulatory team dealt with them. But actually, they're fairly flexible. Within a day, you can book it. Whereas we were saying more about, are you deliberately manipulating for one client over another? And there have been
Yes.
a lot of high level examples of that. So I literally spent 2 days with myself and a couple of members from my team talking to the trade folks. I knew nothing about trade finance. I'm a lawyer. I know nothing about numbers. So I spent 2 days with the trade finance team looking at their pinch points, their difficulties, their regulatory impact, what they actually did, how they booked a trade. And then we created a training for them to explain how you can manage the bribery, corruption, fraud risks in relation to those. And the CEO, again, they were very, very complimentary and became, again, another supporter because we took the time. But again, you're busy. I get it. It is. I'm saying things that occurred maybe in different worlds or in different capabilities, and I had a bigger team, etc., etc. The reality is, it's hard, but trust me, the amount of work you'll save yourself in the long term if you can get involved early will be huge. And one of the organization work said everything is about understanding the business. And we know that, and you know that, and you try, but you've got to get your head up from the weeds sometimes. And it's so difficult. And I sound like somebody, like a parent advising other parents how to bring up kids, which I would always say to ignore any parents, they talk nonsense. But that's part of the new role. And if that means giving up on some of the more perfunctory data mining, use AI to save yourself the time, great. That's where AI can save you.
So what you're describing is more front foot. It's more being proactive to understand the business, understand the context, understand the strategic direction of the organization, and how you can partner and support the business in achieving those goals. We're moving towards the end of our 30 minutes. In a moment, again, I'm going to ask you if there's anything that you'd just like to finish on. But before we do, can I just draw out some strands that I think have flowed from the conversation? And each one of them, I find myself thinking, each one, I think this is so important. So the first is partnership approach. We are the servant, we are partnering with the business, we're providing solutions rather than problems. The second is,
Sorry, can I just interrupt on
please,
that?
please.
A lot of compliance teams I've seen, particularly when I was overseeing them as a prosecutor, a lot of them said, yes, we were partners of the business, but they partnered with the business in relation to compliance. I would say you were a partner of the business in relation to the business.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Absolutely. So we partner with the business in relation to the business. I'm going to say it again because it is so important. The second thing I've taken from this is the importance of a narrative, that we're clear about what we are. And we might have to calibrate that according to the size of the compliance function, the investment within it, and the nature of the business. We might have to calibrate that story, but we have a story and we're clear in our own minds around what our role is within compliance. A third thing we've talked about is early engagement. And I think that fits with the partnership approach. And alongside that, an understanding of the regulatory context that's immediate, it's there, it's contemporary. So you can contribute to understanding and conversations rather than having to take things away, separate meeting, 2-3 weeks time, and then involving lawyers or whatever. It may be that you have to caveat your advice and your opinions until you've just checked and double checked, but having that level of understanding, but that's matched to an understanding of the business, the way in which it operates, its products, its services, its supply chains, and so on. And I think finally, moving away from a binary approach. Maybe that's intrinsic in what we've been talking about, but we're moving away from sort of yes, no, into more of a conversation, more nuanced, more informed. And part of that, of course, is listening. And you've emphasized that, I think, in the context of the trade work that you did. That's so important that we just listen, because the assumptions that we might make about the business will just simply be wrong on occasions. And we have to understand that and correct our thinking.
And most organizations I've ever worked with, most teams love to tell you about what they do, particularly if you're compliance, because they're desperately trying to get you to stop invading them. So actually, you'll be surprised how open they are to those conversations if you be open to them.
Good advice. Thank you. Any last words from yourself, Gaon?
Well, I think in an article and something I was looking up was Andy Rooney, a US television writer and author. And he said, my advice is not to wait to be struck by an idea. If you're a writer, you sit down and damn well decide to have an idea. And that's the way to get an idea. And I think a lot of compliance officers I've spoken to, considering and with understandable reason, they're busy, etc., they're firefighting all the time, they haven't got time, is they do sit there and go, oh well, nobody's approached me, or nobody's asked, or they don't get me involved in that, or I haven't spoken to that. If you want an idea, sit down, create an idea and go out there and positively. The trade finance team did not come to me. They were happy with their regulatory. I saw that there was a risk, went to them and said, okay, do you mind talking us through it for a couple of days? And I expected them to say, oh, we're too busy. And I ended up in a room with sort of 5 of them for 2 days, really desperately trying to get me on side and explain where the challenges are. So I do think that proactivity, that, if you see something in your business, have a responsibility for the business. You want them to grow. If they grow, you'll get more. If you get reputational benefit from it, you'll get more support. You go out there, seize the day, carpe diem. That would be it. Again, please accept the fact that I know it's not easy. I've done it. I've been there. I've been rejected. I'm only telling you the positive stories. I'm not telling you the negative ones. But it makes a difference. If you go out there, you will get pockets of support. And once you get a few, you find the business all coming round slowly towards you.
Gaon, thank you. As we draw to a close, can I just mention that the ICA has shared a survey asking for your thoughts about governance, risk, and compliance issues. If you've joined us today, wherever you are in the world, please take 5-10 minutes, all it will take, in order to complete that survey. You'll find details of it and a link to it in the comments section for today's event. If you do that, you'll get early access to the report that's going to be generated on the back of this. And of course, importantly, you'll be contributing to the way in which compliance, governance, and risk are evolving across the world today. But as I say that, can I thank again Gaon for your time, your interest. It's always fun and enjoyable chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining me again. And thank you, wherever you are in the world, for joining us today for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.